I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United
the
States
United States of America, and to the
the
republic
for
for
which it stands, one
nation,
under
under
God.
God, indivisible,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As a way of respecting, honoring, and creating awareness about our past, we begin our village board meetings by acknowledging that New Paltz is on the ancestral land of the Munsee, Esopus, and Lenape people.
Thank you. So the purpose of this meeting is for our continued conversation regarding the project where we've been working on with the Historic Preservation Commission, but it's also an official village board meeting. So we have a couple of things that I wanted to add to this agenda at the end. So number one is a couple of reorg items. Number two is related to a lawsuit. And number three is related to getting a portion of Mohonk Preserve property appraised for our groundwater well project. So we can go over those details at the end of the meeting. So I'd like to.
PT, did you also want to add something?
Oh yeah, if there's time, only if there's time, because we can do it next time. If there isn't, we should just have a conversation at some point soon, if not tonight, about resuming in-person meetings. And I thought we should spitball maybe doing something outside.
Okay, we can put that on as a final item. So I'd like to motion that we approve the agenda as amended.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And anyone want to make an announcement?
I can log in.
No announcements this evening. Do we have any public comments?
I did actually. There is the police town hall tomorrow night
It's
at
working.
6:30.
Although I
Information
don't-
is on the town website. If people hadn't heard already, they're doing their police commission meeting this month will be a town hall.
Say that again. What time tomorrow?
6:30.
6:30 tomorrow, and that's a Zoom call.
Yes, Zoom call, and you
I'm
can
on
get the Zoom
camera.
info on the town website
I
or
think it's
Facebook.
okay. I think.
It's 6:30, right, Alex?
Sure. I don't know what it is.
6:30 to 8.
It could be that Odyssey got the wrong date. It's supposed to be tomorrow night.
Hey, Tom, do you have your mic on right now? I think he does. There he goes. Okay, so this
Tim?
agenda.
Just one announcement. I'm sorry. I thought I was speaking. I wasn't. There'll be a ceremony to rededicate a plaque to Julia Jackson at the playground, New Paltz Playground, 7:00 on Friday, the 19th, this coming Friday. It's a Zoom event, and we'll be broadcasting it on YouTube. So there's an invite on Facebook, and you can look to that for information.
Thanks, Bill. Excellent. So we have previously submitted public comments, and then we also have.
Previously when? Like how long ago?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like what Ariana has created.
We've been having these meetings.
Right. So Ariana has created a folder for any public comments that we've received. So that's very helpful.
Oh, no, I see that. Okay.
And
Sorry.
it seems like all of them are from early May, and then there's one from April. So it's nice to know that those exist. And if folks want to continue to share their thoughts, it's great to know that they're all available. Okay, so why don't we jump right into tonight's main focus? Tom, do you want to give us an update on where we've been and some of the updated changes we've made, or at least our latest thinking?
Yes, absolutely. Can people hear me?
Yes, Tom.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm so sorry for fooling around at the beginning. I was having really bad connection issues, which seems to be increasing. But thank you, Tim. I'm really grateful for the chance to just lay out some of the big ideas that we've been thinking about in the HPC. And I'm going to be as brief as I possibly can in the hopes that we can have a conversation. I think the main thing that we have been thinking about with the code revisions is some new thinking about the direction to take. I think the short version of what I'll say is that we had some objections from the planning board as we followed up on the last workshop meeting with you all. And a lot of those objections kind of revolved around the objection to village-wide designation of all of New Paltz Village as a historic district. And that is correct. I mean, it's correct to object to that because the village is actually pretty eclectic. And so with some advice from Rick Golden, that was
I'm not hearing Tom very well. Seems like there's a little trouble with the connection. Hey, Tom.
Will, and it was confirmed to be a review board and a separate architectural, sometimes it's called a design review board and process that would be separate from the actual key historical resources in the village. So what we would be doing in effect is setting up two processes. One is a higher stakes process, and it would have to do with, in the existing situation, Huguenot Street. And the other process would be a much, much lower standard where we're really just looking for some basics of architectural or design thinking and planning. So we'd be thinking about very general things like massing, wheels, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, but without kind of the baggage that comes with historical and maybe some of the scariness that I think there are some advantages to this. And I wish 2 years ago I had been as informed about this because I probably would have been lobbying in these terms. But I think advantage number one is that we would come up with a solution that much better fits the village situation, which is the majority of the homes in the village are not contributing to any direct sense of the historical character. And so we would not be burdening those homeowners with a process and with standards that don't really apply, let's say, to a 60s raised ranch that happens to be on a village street. Number two is we would separate the function of the Historic Preservation Commission. Michelle, I just saw a text or a chat challenging.
Yeah, it's super choppy. Something's going on.
Yeah, Tom, is there any way you could
Clearly
move?
hearing-
Is there any way you could move to a spot where your Wi-Fi connection may be stronger?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I think it's actually, my computer's a pretty aged one. Give me a half a second, everybody. I'm so sorry for the
Yeah, no worries.
We're used to this
complications.
kind of stuff with regularity.
Yeah, it's become a way of life, hasn't it? But I'm going to go to what I would consider my. Okay.
Tom,
Is
if it
this any
doesn't work
better?
on video, maybe just call in with one of the phone numbers.
Or might it also work better if you turn your camera off, right? Where it just picks up your audio? Ari,
Yeah.
could that help?
Definitely.
Little better? I can see you now, KT.
I can hear you better.
Yeah.
I'm actually on my phone, which I think is my fastest device these days. Is this any better?
That does seem a little better.
Yeah, my wife just lent me. Okay, I'm gonna get my phone off. I really am. Okay, I'm gonna get my phone off. I really am so sorry. This is.
No sweat.
Okay. I'm just going to go back and assume that a lot of what I said wasn't audible. Are we still hearing me okay? Tim?
Yeah, I would agree. It'd be probably best if you just started over.
Okay, I really am so sorry. This is becoming a bigger issue. But I wanted to just update everybody that we have done some new thinking about the code revisions, and to a large extent, they came out of resistance that we were getting, or concerns and resistance we were getting out of the planning board last time we conferred with them. And a lot of that had to do with an objection that historic requirements should not be placed on the entire village. And, you know, we shouldn't in effect make the entire village a historic district when it's not. And the HPC agrees with that thinking. But a solution was offered by Rick Golden, confirmed by Will Frank, and then most recently confirmed by the State Historic, or the Office of State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation up in Albany, to whom we report every year. And all of them agreed that the solution is to establish a completely separate architectural review, or sometimes called design review process, with a lower standard, and a standard that doesn't necessarily have the baggage that historical can sometimes have, and I think in our current moment definitely has. And the HPC talked about this on Monday, and we all agree that it definitely has some advantages. And I would characterize those as, you know, basically three major advantages. One is that the legislation would better fit the situation of the village, where in fact we have a couple of pockets of deep historical significance, but we also have a lot of streets with an eclectic mix of houses going up to, you know, the late 20th century that definitely wouldn't really apply. And so this would allow us not to try to use one instrument to oversee the development of the village architecturally. Number two, we could separate the function of the Historic Preservation Commission from the function of the Architectural Review Board. And number three is that it turns out a lot of municipalities in New York do exactly this. They have an Architectural Review Board that operates in some kind of parallel fashion to a Historic Preservation Commission. Some places don't have a Historic Preservation Commission. They just have a design review. So in a very quick survey provided by the attorneys and Zach Bieletsky, our board member, Rye, the city of Rye, has this set up. Saratoga Springs has a very well set up, distinctive historic preservation commission that operates in parallel to a design review board. The town of Southampton, Sag Harbor, the village of Montebello, Ossining, Woodstock, Irvington, New York, and I'm sure there are a lot of other places. Everybody assured me that this is a tried and true strategy. I think one of the things that I find interesting is that the law permits an architectural review board to be completely congruent with the HPC. It can be the same personnel. It can be totally different personnel, or it can be overlapping personnel. So you're totally free to structure it as you want, so long as the criteria and the processes for approval are distinctly laid out and are distinct from each other. And I think that's pretty, I think that's very promising, because we don't necessarily have to create a new commission. And I know Tim and everybody, you know, we have to be sensitive to the fact that getting volunteers and keeping volunteers is a challenge in the community. So we don't want to set up another 5-person or 7-person commission and hope to staff it. So it can remain within historic preservation. And we would just make sure that the process is different and that we're very, very clearly laying out the standards. And so maybe the last thing I wanted to say is that what typically you get with an architectural review board is much more general and less detailed interest in basic issues of consistency. So the mass of a building, the setback of a building, the basic architectural style, some attention to forms and materials, but you're not getting down into some of the things that a historic preservation commission can get into. For example, like in Saratoga Springs, wooden windows, because they're really, really historic. And so they have this completely separate process that guides new construction and renovation and just kind of keeps it in the character of the village. The person I talked to up in Albany said, you know, that they basically kind of think of it as a gateway to the historic heart of the community. So they don't want to try to make the gateway into the historic heart. They just want it to complement it or not degrade it. So I think that's really promising. And I think that the proposal I would like to make is that with your blessing and encouragement, we would go back to Will Frank and say, let's be thinking about leaving the Historic Preservation Commission charge as it is. And let's write some legislation that creates this architectural, we can call it a design review board if we want. We can call it whatever we want, but that's the basic idea. And that would capture a lot of the things that we were trying to articulate, but ran into this, you know, pretty strong sense of resistance on our own planning board that this is not going to go over very well in the community because it's too closely tied to this idea of historic preservation. So that's what our current thinking is. I wanted to add one other thing, which I mentioned to Tim today on a brief phone call, and that is, if we were to do this, which is actually what my advice is now, I think we should also really think seriously about creating a second historic district analogous to historic Huguenot Street, because what we're trying to protect in the Main Street downtown business corridor is really of high historic value. And I think that if we were to create a second district and then an architectural review process for all the rest of the village, make sure that they're totally distinct and have much different standards and much different thresholds, then I think that would almost be a perfect solution. And so that's what I would like to propose that we talk about tonight. I'm going to stop there. I also just wanted to let people know that if you would like an update on where the HPC is with the Jacob Wynkoop houses that have been so much in on people's minds recently, the Pencil Hill property, even the restoration of the sign for the African American burial ground on Huguenot Street. We've been talking about all that, and I'd be very happy to update you if you want me to do that. So Tim, I'm going to send it back to you and the board, and please ask me questions, or I'd love to hear your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, let's absolutely circle back on the Wine Coop properties and your discussion as a Historic Preservation Commission, and we can share a concept that the village board has been working on a little bit. So there's lots of very interesting projects that we're working on, and hopefully we can have more details to announce soon. We mentioned that on our planning board meeting last week, but I'm super appreciative of the direction that this concept seems to be headed in, and I feel like this concept, we wrestled with this some time ago when we were looking at, what the code could look like. And, the word historic has like legal and emotional connotations that we just absolutely need to be careful with. And I think the process here is absolutely not about trying to create a HPC review process similar to what we need on Huguenot Street, for instance. This conversation really came out of a lot of community feedback when the planning board in 2014 approved the large steel and concrete structure on Main Street at 41 Main Street. And, that was a design that, some people are okay with, but it's been hard for many other people. Could that same building, even, not terribly different, but, could things have been done to its design that would have made it feel like it fits better with its neighboring buildings? And it seems like that probably would have been done very differently if there was the likes of an architectural review process that we're trying to institute with this concept. So I think it's really important that that folks understand, like, why are we even having this conversation? But it actually came out of a community response to the structure at 41 Main Street. And then the other example that I regularly bring up is this idea of it's almost like free consulting. Like, for instance, if I live in a house and I need to replace its windows and the house is of a certain design or aesthetic, what do I know about what kind of windows would look best in that style house? Like, I don't know anything about architecture. So the idea would be there would be a process where I could sit with the Historic Preservation Commission or members of the Historic Preservation Commission on an architectural review board, and they could say, well, your house is of this design, instead of grabbing those off-the-shelf windows at Lowe's, grab those other off-the-shelf windows at Lowe's, and they would fit better with the design of your house. And when we've explored this idea with developers, they're like, this is exactly what we would love to have. We would love to have that type of feedback. It's not about making a process more arduous or more expensive. It's more about leaning on, neighbors who might just find, this work more interesting than maybe someone else who just knows that they need new windows. So I think that's another important example, that frames out what we're trying to do here. But, any other village board members want to add something right now?
I can go. Thank you for that update, Tom. Lots of really good stuff in there that I'm happy to hear. I love to see the process of like getting feedback and then integrating it and like moving to the next iteration of something, making it better, which sometimes is so hard in this community work, but you guys are doing a good job at it right now. I like how you said it's not going to be the whole village. I would use another example. Thank you, Tim, because I keep saying like we need to like tell the community the why behind this. Tim did a good job of saying the why. And I mean that why as articulated, sort of like I don't hate that building. I don't hate the triangle building. I don't hate when buildings don't fit together the way that you described it. So like I'm one of those people that I'm like, I don't know. And that subjectivity I just really wrestle with, and that embedding the status quo. Which isn't to say I think that we don't need to do something. I'm just wrestling with the nuances of this. I'm not at all throwing the baby out with the bathwater with my comments. I'm just being super forthright about just like, there's things I don't like about that building, but it's not those, it's because bad decisions were made. And although I will say, I wish it wasn't so far out into the sidewalk. So that might have been a thing that you would have covered, right? And you probably would have caught that they didn't have enough for the mechanicals on the roof as well, somehow.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, if I can, I'll just jump in on those two things.
Yeah, go ahead.
The setback, so the distance from the street is an absolute, like there's a guarantee we would have caught that and raised it as a problem, because what it does, it violates one of the really basic principles that we're trained up with. There is a line that's established by those storefronts, and the building that used to be there was on that line, and it just creates this problem for no good reason, by disturbing that. As to the second thing, I often thought about that if we had been another set of eyes, would we have caught that mechanicals problem? I don't think I can guarantee that we would have, but I think I can guarantee there's a better chance than if nobody, if 5 other people weren't trying, it may have come up. I just can't guarantee, because it's not quite the obvious thing that a setback is. But, I agree with you. I think there are elements of that building that are really pretty good. I think the westward facing, we probably could have done a lot to help the westward facing side of that, which to me has never worked. It's just too monolithic. And I've gone over in my head and even talked to a local architect about little tweaks that would have made that less monolithic, like just a little step in, like a 6-inch step in 20 feet up would have created a different space instead of just this big concrete mass. So I didn't mean to, jump in that much, but
No,
just
it's okay.
on those 2 points, for sure.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you did that, because I as I was speaking, I was like, oh, maybe you would have caught these 2 things and those 2 things. So that's, and like 100% a second set of eyes. Of course you can't say you would have, but
Right.
in my biz, I have 3 sets of eyes, everything that goes out the door,
Yeah.
because I want all those eyes.
Which is sort of, to the
So
point that
that's a really compelling part. It's just, yeah.
yeah.
I want to add, because I absolutely do not want to pick on 41 Main Street. It's
It's actually
like
51, Tim, I think.
Yeah, I think it's 51.
Oh, I think you're right. Okay. Well, I don't want to pick on this particular Main Street building, because I use this phrase like free consulting, and Tom, George Seafree, myself, the developer, the architect, we actually met out on Main Street, after the building was constructed, unfortunately. But when we were trying to brainstorm with them about, some of these concepts, I felt like the feedback we received was they wished that these conversations were happening, much earlier, and I feel like it wasn't a situation where the developer was like, I want to build this building and we don't care, how the community responds. If anything, the developer had a loose vision and really would have appreciated some of this feedback that we're trying to create a space for that to happen in.
Yeah, I totally could see that developers and applicants would want clarity on this stuff. I'm totally like seeing the light on that as a whole, like the clarity on all zoning code and all this stuff, better clarity is really, really good. Front end, front end, front end, front end. I totally get that. I totally get that. I guess it's just I think it'll be really helpful. I didn't get a chance to look at those other examples, and I want to look at some of the other because I think we only have two of the ones you rattled off. I
Yeah.
know I've been on the Saratoga website because during the NBR stuff I was looking at all their stuff, so I know they have Rockstar stuff. I remember it. It's all very nice websitey too. So their aesthetic extends to their online presence.
Yeah.
I also want to get a little clarity too on this concept of like, well, it's no longer village-wide. I mean, my understanding is that there's still a village-wide process, but that there'll be a process for, one portion of the village, which probably should have a different type of review, and then still a process for the entire village. Am I correct? And
Yeah.
I think it's important that like what you're suggesting is not jettisoning the idea of a village-wide process.
That's right, Tim. And I think, as I'm starting, and I'm really only starting to look at the other communities' ways of defining it, you tend to get in the let's call it the village-wide, the non-historic district review would be really basic, just, I keep using an example from Grove Street. Like, there's this nice cottage house that several years ago, long before any of us were actually, I might have even been on the Historic Preservation Commission, but we weren't asked. But, long before any of your tenure, the planning board wasn't probably even consulted because all it took was a building permit to triple the size of this nice little cottage, put the wrong siding on it, put this ugly rectangle next to a house that had some integrity, and it was all legal, right? So I think that what we're looking for is just preventing like the worst things that can happen village-wide, things that would actually anger neighbors. The neighbors would come screaming like, where's the process? Well, there is no process because we haven't written laws that permit that. So Tim, just to clarify, so what I'm suggesting and what the attorneys are both suggesting is there's one sort of low threshold, low level review village-wide, and then there's historic Huguenot Street, and I'm also suggesting that we should really be thinking about Main Street as the second and probably final historic district in New Paltz. So everybody else is subject to that lower threshold. Main Street and Huguenot Street are subject to that higher threshold that's kind of got historical in it. It's even crossed my mind that maybe the Historic Preservation Commission needs to change its name. Like maybe we just become the Architectural Review Board and we clarify that there are these two districts with two different processes. I don't know if that's just like living in the moment where historical is starting to take on more and more baggage that I don't really want it to. And, or I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but it's occurred to me that maybe we've got the wrong name. We just send out the wrong kind of vibe.
But I love that. The Grove Street example really resonated with me, and I've been thinking about it a lot. And part of my response was like, yeah, that works on Grove Street, but it doesn't work in the NBR, right? Like we actually want to to change that neighborhood, right? And there's actually that language, that short bit of language about design standards in our comprehensive plan that I wrestled with during the NBR because it actually embeds the status quo in this way where you're like supposed to stay with the neighborhood character. And a Grove Street has a homogenous, or did have a homogenous character. At NBR we want to change and other streets don't. So if we only do Main Street, it wouldn't solve the Grove Street problem if there's other streets that you think need to be protected from that scenario. I'm thinking of my own street and I'm like, no, I don't have any of the historic And I guess I do want to hear more about just what the low level review would be on the other places as well.
Mhm.
But I wanted to make sure I said that tonight, because I think the Grove Street example really works, except we're not all Grove Street.
No, that's really true. And I think that's one of the lessons that we learned in talking to the planning board. One of the people who spoke said, you know, what about my 60s raised ranch or my 60s house? And, you know, I found myself backpedaling saying, you know, we probably don't need to look at it, but, you know, you have to kind of go with the code that you write. And so that's, you know, to your point, KT, we are really trying to get this right. It is, you know, better to get clarity in the law. And so that's one reason that I think that we should write something that pretty much everybody in the village who lives in a 60s or a 90s house could feel happy about. So to get back to that Grove Street example, one really concrete thing that I would say is that the design review should say you can't put vinyl siding on a house that has a different kind of siding. Like you can't do Franken siding, right? Choose one or the other or something like that. Because that tends to be a permanent feature. I mean, you know, it's going to be generations before somebody looks at that problem and tries to remedy it. And folks, if you've never had the chance to look at this house that I'm kind of using as an example, you'll see what I mean. I mean, it's just like no attempt to match what it was being attached to. And then what followed up was this huge illegal parking lot, because now you've got this huge house with lots of people who have cars. So like it all snowballs, and pretty soon you're living next to something that can never be anything except it, you know, what it has become. To the NBR, KT, I agree. We're definitely trying to be proactive about what that space looks like. And I think there's room for architectural experimentation within that. But actually, one of the reasons that we're trying to redo the NBR is that there wasn't really any oversight when all that stuff popped up in the 40s and 50s and 60s, right? We're trying to actually undo a laissez-faire attitude toward development that now, you know, embarrasses us and doesn't work, or isn't an optimal use of space. So, you know, I think I get what you're saying about the NBR, and there should be room for variety within that. But I guess if you think about it as a historical problem, the historical problem comes because nobody was really watching what was developed. It was whatever the developer wanted.
Yeah, totally agree. We're being very intentional with what we want to do there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say something. So I hate siding. I think it's ugly and ugly. But the bit about that I wrestle with, and I know they can turn into monsters, is we're like pricing out people from our community, because doesn't it cost less to do siding? So I don't want to price out the young couple that could buy a house or rehab a house that way, but not if they have to do it all the more expensive ways that are in some code that we make it more expensive. So that little piece there, I sort of wrestle with. I mean, am I right? Isn't siding cheaper?
Well, it kind of
I don't know.
depends.
I mean, I could be wrong about that, but the general point I think applies to some of this stuff.
Yeah. I guess I would answer that in a couple of ways. One is, you know, siding is often cheaper upfront, but it also degrades faster. You know, so we're into all kinds of short and long-term ideas of what's economical. But you know, we were a young couple on a budget once too. I mean, I get that, and in some ways we're still on a budget. So that's a thing. But on the other side, you know, we don't want to be too proactively protecting, and this happens a lot, out-of-town landlords who buy a historic building that, let's say, has wood siding and details that ennoble the village, and covering it in siding so that they can make a lot of money renting it to students. Like, that's a reality too. And so this becomes a very delicate, tight wire act of asking who you're protecting and why.
I would also,
Problem with our code, right? Sorry, I just like I feel like sometimes it's like thinking all of our housing is students and rentals, and some of it isn't, but it's mostly that.
Yeah.
but KT, I would, and this has been an important theme for the last several years, why we've kicked this concept around. The idea would be to, have, like, let's say a family or a young couple that's starting out, like you're concerned about, and the idea is that the folks who are involved in this review process are probably more familiar with, to my example, which windows to get. They know where you could, what style of windows might be more affordable, what quality siding would work better than what they might have assumed. So it's kind of like you're leaning on the folks on this review board to help you as a resource. Like that I think is, how this could work and how it could work well and actually like truly add value and make things like less expensive.
I think we should look at Village of Austening's architectural review board like law, because they also are a place that recently signed on to rent stabilization, and they have a higher rate of households that rent than there's like a lot of their surrounding area. Although they are lower than us, they're at 50% households rent, whereas we're 70, 73 and change. So I think we should really look at that example and see how they tie those two issues in. Of course, the rent stabilization is newer than their architectural review board. I have no idea. I didn't really dig too deep into it, but maybe even reaching out to them, and seeing how they're kind of accommodating all those different things that I think maybe Saratoga isn't dealing with, for example.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true, Alex. And Saratoga, I'm with KT, like they do everything really, really nicely. But New Paltz is not Saratoga, and I don't have ambitions to become Saratoga, and we can't. We're already way too eclectic. So I think that's really good, Alex. I just took that down as a note to really kind of think about that in the context of a community that's a lot more similar to us than we are to Saratoga. Yeah, that's good.
I think for me, I had a couple of questions that just stuck out and sort of has to do with personal taste as far as not just the historic district, but village-wide. The two things that jumped out and I just have questions about is the change of light fixtures or signs, and what does that mean? And also there was another phrase that said appropriate color options. So I just don't know what that means to, I think an appropriate color might mean something different to different people.
Yeah, I'll give you a little history, Michelle, on color. The HPC, frankly, would rather not deal with color because people value it a lot. And and rightly, the color of your house is a big, big statement and it's important to people. But from a historic preservation point of view, we're really not that concerned about things that can change with new owners. Like what is much more worrisome to us is ripping off a historic porch, like just deciding, it's starting to go and we're just going to tear it off. And or the example I gave a few minutes ago, you want to turn a historic house into rental property, siding's easier to maintain, so you just slap siding and cover all the detail. Those are kind of permanent features, or destroying the symmetry of a row of windows because you want to cut it up into more bedrooms. These things happen all over the place if nobody's watching the farm. So the reason that color's in there at all is the planning board asked us to put it back in. Like they wanted us to be the arbiter of that. Camilla's on this call, and she's been our sort of go-to person for color. But basically, we just hand them the palette of historical colors. You know, all the major paint companies have these things that, you know, are appropriate to 19th century American houses. And, you know, you're looking at, I don't know, Camilla, 100, 200 chips usually. I mean, it's not very, in fact, Camilla, what would you say to that?
Yes, there is definitely a big selection of color choices if you are looking at strictly historical colors. But I think the HPC's role, even in the historic district, even on Huguenot Street, we were just an advisory role that we played. We never really said to anyone, oh, you can't paint your house such and such color. We are always there to advise people if they need it. And as Tom said, depending on the age of the house, there are still some colors that would be considered appropriate for that style of house or that age of house. But I don't think we really had a very strict role in color choices. And I think the intention that we have for the Architectural Review Board is just to be an advisory capacity, work in an advisory capacity and not dictate any color. And murals came up as well. Some people mentioned that how can we decide what's aesthetically pleasing and what's not. And we are not trying to stifle anyone's creativity either. The concern is more about the type of paint that they use to ensure that whatever they paint on their walls actually will stay on and not wash off in the rain after a couple of months. So I think our role would be just to ensure that changes that are made to houses are, how do you say, I can't think of the word, I'm sorry. Consistent with the style.
Yeah.
And,
no, I think that's exactly it, Camilla. You know, to KT's point earlier about subjectivity, I mean, this is definitely something, and Michelle, I think you're kind of asking this too. We try not to be subjective. I mean, obviously every human being is subjective at some level or you know, uses powers of interpretation, but historic preservation commissions are supposed to determine appropriateness, not beauty. And so, you know, I might actually hate Victorian trim houses, like just as an aesthetic. I would be a really bad commissioner if I didn't recognize that the job is to, you know, in a district that has a lot of them, to recognize that that's the district, that, you know, the houses grew up at a certain time in history and use a certain architectural vocabulary. And that would be what the commission should be using as far as aesthetics. In terms of lighting fixtures, so we are, because we've been operating as a historic preservation commission, that's significant, or it's significant enough that we always ask it for historic properties. I would be pretty sure that if we went to an architectural review board and we're talking about a neighborhood of 60s houses, we just wouldn't get into it. That would be a pretty concrete example, like, you know, the house is set back like the other houses, it's built from roughly the same materials, it's roughly in the same style, put on whatever light you want. Whereas we'd be, you know, looking at that more narrowly and more closely in a context of, say, Main Street, where there's a much more consistent architectural style. One of the things last time we talked, we got a little twisted around with flags and flagpoles because of John's concerns. We have never in 20 years talked about a flagpole. Like, it's just not, it's not an architectural detail. So I just want to use that use this moment to say, you know, we're not ever down to that level of what flag you put up or don't put up. It just isn't, it's not architectural. It's like, I don't know, whether you cut your grass high or low is not our business and never would be. I don't know. I'm thinking of an example that seems as absurd to me on that. Michelle, did I answer all your questions? I felt like there was one other that.
Signage.
Signs.
Oh, signs. Yeah. So as you know, the village already has a sign ordinance. So all we've ever done is made sure that when we see an application, we ask about sign and we make sure that it conforms to the sign ordinance. So, you know, sometimes people aren't aware of that little detail. I think it's only happened a couple of times where they come in with a sign that has too many square feet. So we have basically been another set of eyes, making sure that applicants know that there's a sign ordinance and it's really specific and it's actually building code. It's nothing to do with us. We have helped, in one case that I can remember, we have helped an applicant think about the design, but I don't think we mandated anything. Like ultimately.
So you mean business sign, like a sign for a business?
Correct.
Okay, I misunderstood that. I live in a townhouse, and so there are HOA rules, and one of them involves signs.
Oh, like political signs.
Yeah, political signs, or you know, anything like that. So there are very strict rules by my HOA regarding that. So I just misunderstood what you meant when it said signs. So, but thank you.
No, and thank you, because it's another thing that came up in our discussion with the planning board, or with John's letter to you all, and then subsequent discussion with the planning board. And it helps clarify that, like, we've got to make it clear that we're not talking about political signage or yard sale signage, but, you know, HOAs operate on a tighter, you know, people, by agreeing to rent or buy that condominium, you abide by the HOA. Yeah, we're strictly talking about building signs, and we're really just reinforcing what the sign ordinance is.
Great, thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Tell us about, I think you did a little bit, but tell us about your near-term next steps. You feel like you're going to tighten up some language with assistance from attorneys?
Yeah, I think probably mostly just send it back. I mean, I would like your encouragement to do that before we start spending the village's money to have Will Frank do that. But I think what we would want to ask for is language that would establish an architectural review board. And then we can work with him on what that language would look like. And I think it really would be different from the standards that we now have as recommendations on Main Street and guiding principles on Huguenot Street. So KT, back to the siding question, you know, young couple buys a ranch somewhere on a village street and they want to put vinyl siding on it. You know, I guess the answer is yes. I mean, I think we could maybe be helpful in pointing out that there are also two major kinds of vinyl siding. The stuff that you get in 20-foot strips at Lowe's has seams that are going to pucker. The stuff that comes off a truck, you know, from a company that does that is continuous. And we could be saving them a lot of trouble 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road by saying, you know, this type of vinyl siding is actually going to last a lot longer because water can't get in it. You're not going to see that puckering and those seams that come with the other kind. So, you know, I think we could have a role, even though we would end up having probably no power to say you can't do that in that case. But I wouldn't be comfortable with language that didn't give us power to say no to, you know, slapping it on a 19th century house that has a lot of architectural detail that the community benefits from. And that's what I meant about the Tightwire Act. You know, on the one hand, you have the autonomy that should belong to people who own their own houses. And on the other hand, the community has an interest in preserving what we all look at and see. And it's not easy.
There's also another component to the vinyl siding is environmentally. That vinyl siding may last you 20 years. There's an expression, vinyl is final, but eventually it's going to have to come off. And disposing of vinyl creates a very challenging situation because it's mostly burned, and that burned vinyl goes into our atmosphere. So if anyone's concerned about climate issues, you really don't want to put on vinyl.
Yeah. You know, there's a wonderful documentary film called Blue Vinyl. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it or heard of it. Michelle, I just saw recognition.
I was just Googling it because I was trying to remember. That was a very impactful. I never forgot that, and always knew if I ever bought a house, I wouldn't want it to be vinyl because of the potential for cancer.
Yep. And Bill's right. You know, if you get 20 years out of vinyl, that's doing pretty well. I live in a house that was built in 1904, and almost all the siding is original because it's wood. And yeah, you have to scrape and paint it every once in a while, but you know, it's going to be there in another 100 years, I'm pretty sure. But it's a really good documentary if you ever get a chance to see it.
I just missed what Michelle said. What was the crux of the documentary?
Well, it was actually, if I'm remembering properly, it was about vinyl siding all over areas in Long Island and having these large pockets of cancer clusters, and they attributed it to the vinyl siding on all these homes. So it's a really, and that's probably the extent of my memory. It came out quite a while ago, but it was a really fascinating documentary about the dangers of vinyl siding.
And it was almost too early to make environmentalism much of a focus. It was mostly about health risks and yeah. But Tim, to answer your question, you know, if you all feel that it's a good use of Will's time and the village's budget to have him do so, I would like to direct him to do two things. One is to craft some basic language that would give us some sense of what an architectural review board might look for and what the process would be. I think that because of our volunteer shortage problem, I think that should be congruent with the HPC. We're willing to do it. We could imagine a time when maybe these would be separate or overlapping bodies. But I would also like to have him draft language that would create a second locally designated district, analogous to Huguenot Street, that would pick up the state and national register district. That's basically the Main Street corridor and a little bit of Chestnut Street and a little bit of the side streets. Because I think that those are, you know, that's really a vulnerable part of the community, and a lower standard applied there may not achieve what we really want.
Well, I would like to make a motion that we go ahead and authorize Chair Tom Olson from the HVC to go ahead and ask our attorney Will Frank to consider these edits.
So it sounds like it's just the piece of creating the this new board, right? Because I really want to look at Ossining, and that would be the next step, developing the rest of it. Is that what we're saying? Like, I feel like we should take Alex's idea and try to find other communities that are more demographically, socioeconomically like us.
Katie, I think, you know, I don't know the demographics of all these communities, but I've got a list. I've got 8 already. Zach Bielecki helped a lot, and he found several. And then I got a couple of suggestions from Albany and a couple of suggestions from Will Frank. So we've got 8. We can definitely ask that question about demographics and just kind of think about, you know, we don't have to become Saratoga, as I said. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's always been the objective, is to not try to become a Saratoga or a Rhinebeck, but to absolutely maintain, New Paltz's unique community character. Like the idea is to have a New Paltz that's as welcoming for everyone. Um, we shouldn't strive to be something totally different. That's never been the objective.
And it won't ever work.
Right.
Ultimately.
And I think it's also incredibly important to emphasize that what we're trying to do is to, workshop this concept and get it right, and get a version that we can, share with the public, and keep asking for feedback, which is what we've been doing for some time now. And then have official public hearings, and give our planning board, the required review that we would need for any sort of zoning change. That's always been the goal. Like everything that we're doing now is to just get, I'll call it a final draft, but it's still a draft. Like the objective is to, get close, and then massage any other remaining sharp edges. But that's what we're trying to do. And I think the only way you do this is following a path like we've been following. Like, be patient, look for feedback, sleep on it, think about it, rewrite, look at other communities, just continue to be patient.
Agree.
Yeah, we got to figure out a way to get people involved in this, though. There's like 2 people watching on YouTube right now. I'm wondering if maybe we want to take the show on the road, and good public engagement sometimes has to involve going to the people as opposed to waiting for them to come to you.
Well, I don't think we've ever pretended that like doing stuff via video is the way to engage the public. This has been kind of the reality that we've been handcuffed with during this time. So instead of sitting on our hands and not doing any work, we were going to continue to workshop the idea. That's always, how we've communicated what we've been trying to do. And then, once we get that final draft, it just makes sense to use this time as opposed to not using it. That's
yeah,
all.
no, I don't disagree with that at all. I just am thinking maybe we want to think a little out of the box about how to get people interested. That's all.
Yeah.
Just we could spitball some ideas.
You know,
And yes, absolutely, it's in the context of what we're trapped in now, and we can think about what we could do in 2 months as opposed to 4 months or whatever. Yeah. I mean, Michael Zeeler and I are co-chairs of the master plan committee, and we've been talking about trying to do a different kind of outreach to get us just like a year of engagement before we would even think about going to a funder and trying to get money to do a comprehensive plan. So this stuff is so overlapped, right? I mean, we wanted to have a climate theme to that outreach as well. But this is not separate and distinct at all from that conversation that just, between COVID and the water emergency, the village board and I joke about 2020 goals.
wow. Just like getting to the end of 2020 is the goal.
So,
there's
but
one
Michael
other.
and I are co-chairs of that, and we are thinking about different ways of doing outreach, and maybe we wanted to join forces with the environmental boards. We should be joining forces with you all as well. Just throwing it out there.
I think that's great. I was going to say, I guess 2 things. One is we always have thought of us as kind of protecting the built environment. HPC is a form of environmentalism because we also live in a built environment as well as a natural one. So it makes perfect sense. The other thing I was going to say is just to agree that, in addition to not being able to have live public hearings, we have a very, very hampered newspaper right now. It's been coming out in electronic form and starting to come out in a reduced paper version, but I think it's really apparent that a lot of people follow the news by getting the New Paltz Times, and that's just, it's not happening in the same way now. But I agree, KT. I mean, there can be outreach where, I don't know, we could just sit down and do a YouTube thing talking about these issues and giving a rationale and inviting comment. It doesn't have to be a public meeting formally. I'm not sure I ever heard a second. I'm not sure where we are, Tim, with that motion.
Yeah, I don't even necessarily know that we need an official action. I was more just trying to make sure that the village board was on the same page. Is everyone okay with this idea of having Tom go ahead and reach out?
I think if everyone's okay with it, then you should get a second and just vote on it. You made the motion.
Does anyone want a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Okay, why don't you then go ahead and walk us through the wine coop discussion that the HPC had.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And thanks for that. I hope to have something, back to you all from Will in a couple of weeks. Let's hope. So we had our meeting on Monday, and Wine Coop has been very much on our mind really for a year. I mean, we were talking about the Wine Coop houses literally this time last year, and we've known about them for even more time. But the historical moment was definitely different. We were mostly looking at the Wine Coop houses on architectural grounds. So, the main question was, are these worthy of landmarking? And the answer seemed to be a year ago that, when you look objectively at them architecturally, no, not really. Partly because we haven't had any protections and they've all either been destroyed or so altered that you really would have a hard time making an architectural case. But it is possible to landmark using historical personage as the justification. And I think our historical moment is definitely different. And the HPC feels strongly that Jacob Wine Coop is somebody that we want to bring recognition to. So Tim, to answer your question, we're kind of thinking in two paths here. One is landmarking is a multi-step, long process that, when it's done best, involves the cooperation of the landowner. If we don't have the cooperation of the landowner, technically the village can do it anyway, but we never have. And I don't really want ever to be in that position of just, forcing restriction on somebody because of a house that in 2020 looks different from when the person bought it. But we haven't ruled that out. One of our members suggested one house in particular that still has probably enough architectural detail to warrant serious consideration. There's a second house in the historic district on Huguenot Street that, almost certainly would warrant architectural recognition. So we're thinking of that as kind of the longer term. And in the shorter term, what we would like to do is move much more quickly on some form of recognition that could be a plaque, just kind of stating that Jacob Wine Coop built houses in this area. They are these houses, these ones have been lost, just kind of a descriptive historical panel or some signage. That could also be an article, it could be a handout, could be a section on the HPC site, but something that could happen in weeks or months rather than months or years. So that's one main thing that we've been doing. The other thing is, at our meeting, we pledged to help Josephine Bloodgood from Historic Huguenot Street, who is almost done with a pretty lengthy article on Joseph Wine Coop. And we said, when you feel that article is ready, please let us know how we can help promote it and bring it to people's attention. So again, that doesn't really take money. It just takes coordination and the resources that we already have. And then the fourth thing that we've been looking into is that there's been quite a lot of discussion about the Pencil Hill lot. And I think some of that may be misinformation. We're really hampered because at the moment we can't get back into the historic collection in Elting Library, but we would like to look into the Pencil Hill lot to see if there might in fact be a burial ground there. And if there is, that's another thing that we can recognize. There are a lot of indications that maybe there isn't a burial ground, but it is almost certain that there was an African-American church there, which is probably actually sort of enclosed by a much larger house now. But again, we don't have the ability right now to make a really sound historical determination about that, but we're interested in doing that. And then the last thing that we've been working on is there is a historical marker on the north end of Huguenot Street that marks where the African-American burial ground was or was near. That sign, as somebody pointed out on Facebook, is not particularly well restored, or it's not well maintained. And so we've been looking at maybe a volunteer committee or maybe some volunteer money that would pay somebody to repaint it. And that actually took a few steps because it wasn't clear to me or to a lot of people who owns the sign or who's supposed to maintain the sign. But as far as the State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation is concerned, the local community can maintain it. So unless the village wants to make a claim on doing that, we can probably mobilize volunteers to do that. And I think that would be a beautiful thing. I mean, I think that would be a great news story. I think that would be a great statement about the village recognizing that this sign's important, but, you know, has fallen into bad maintenance or, you know, hasn't been maintained in a while. So kind of that's a lot of what we talked about on Monday, which is the first meeting we've really had since a lot of attention started to focus on Jacob Wynkoop. But there's some good possibilities. And Tim, you'd mentioned just kind of passingly that you may be working on something that could correspond to our efforts, and that would be great too.
Yeah, I shared with you earlier today a project that we're working on with it seems like a very cooperative and motivated property owner, where one of the Wynkoop houses is located. It has some other really interesting historical significance. So our fingers are crossed that that project will see the light of day. We should know hopefully in the near term, and I think it'll dovetail really nicely with everything that you described. Like it could be a central spot to tie a lot of these you know, historical events together, and could be like a really fantastic spot for our community. So our fingers are crossed, and hopefully we'll have some encouraging news to share more publicly in the very near term.
So exciting. And yeah, we stand by to help. I've already actually started pricing plaques using a company or looking at a company that we've used for our individual landmarking plaques. And, you know, they don't come cheap. I mean, we're talking about custom bronze plaques, but there may be some community interest in getting behind that financially. There may be a donor, you know, but Tim, you've got our cooperation on that if that project comes to fruition.
Thank you so much for all of that, Tom, and everyone.
Well, thank you all. I mean, I'm really thankful because it's another beautiful June evening, and I've used up an hour plus of your time. But no, thank you very much. I hope to be able to report something soon. And actually, KT, in the short run, once I assemble this list of communities, let me share that with the village board as well as the HPC. As I mentioned, Zach already found several really good resources, and I found a few, and I think we can keep digging for, you know, a couple of weeks and then present you with those examples and maybe some comments
That sounds perfect.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate the time
Thank you.
and the interest. Okay, great. Well, I'll sign off, and thank you, Zach, Valerie, and Camilla for joining us as well.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Tom.
Good night.
Okay, thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
All right, I'm trying to find our agenda. Sorry, I gotta reopen it.
The first item on the business agenda is the reorg stuff.
I just posted the link to it in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, I motion that we update the reorg item, appointing Roseanne James as a deputy village treasurer tax collector for 1 year.
Second.
All in favor?
Hi.
I motion we appoint ZBA members. So Noah Simmons as an alternate with a term that ends May of 2022, and Tony Saraceno as a full member with a term that ends May 2025.
Second.
All in favor?
Hi.
And then there's another item. There's a dispute between some property owners on North Chestnut Street and Church Street about a sewer service line going across neighbors' properties. So the neighbors on North Chestnut Street, I guess, presented this to a judge, and the judge suggested that the village be included. So I'm going to motion that we accept service of the third-party summons and complaint on behalf of the village regarding a suit with certain property owners on North Chestnut who are seeking a judgment against certain property owners on Church Street that the Church Street owners have no right to convey sewage through the North Chestnut Street properties. May I have a second? Or we can discuss, maybe second for a discussion.
I'll second for discussion. I just want to know what that means.
So basically what it is, and there's weird situations like this throughout the village where, like, years ago, someone ran a sewer line across someone else's property. And now that there's an issue with that sewer line, the neighbors have to sort it out between themselves. And, they often come to us and they're like, fix our problem. And we're like, we can't because it's on your private property. And they're like, but we don't have any, clear, legal path that says this happened or that happened. And, unfortunately, things were maybe not done with the best record keeping in the past. So, it's the village is being asked to, I guess, provide comment, but, it's really a conversation between private property owners. And this is common throughout the village. I've been pulled into these conversations many times. Not always are we asked to, participate and discuss with judges, but I guess that's what's going on, where these property owners haven't been able to work it out amongst themselves.
So we're like bearing witness, kind of.
That's my understanding.
Cool. I'm cool with that.
Yeah. Okay, so all in favor?
Hi.
And then the other item that I added to today's agenda, I've been working on this for 3 years, but we received encouraging news from the Mohonk Preserve after their board met over the weekend. So we had an easement to do a test well on property that is preserved owned, and it's right across the street or I'm sorry, not across the street, across the property line from our water treatment plant property on Mountain Rest Road. And what we're looking to do is acquire this small area. It'll be about 3 acres in total from the Mohonk Preserve. And the Mohonk Preserve and the village would require a third party to appraise the property so we could agree on a price. So I'm going to motion that we retain Ackerley and Hubble for $1,500 to perform a documented or restricted appraisal to meet the Mohonk Preserve's due diligence obligations for the approximately 3-acre area where well 7 is located off Mountain Rest Road next to our water treatment plant property.
Second.
Any other questions? But this is, this is a really cool project. We've identified some good producing wells on our property, and then this would augment those wells. And the idea is to source more local water in addition to the surface water reservoirs that we have next to the water treatment plant property. So all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? So I think that's it. Or did you want to talk about outdoor meetings?
So how would outdoor meetings work? Like, where would we meet?
Technologically speaking, because we'd obviously need to still do what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
If we did it outside of Village Hall, we could use the Village Hall Wi-Fi. I'm not sure how far it reaches. Like, it might just be kind of right in front or in between the buildings, could work. But I don't know if it goes all the way to Peace Park or not, which would be obviously like lovely.
It doesn't make it to all the way through Peace Park. I can tell you that much because I don't have internet right now. I couldn't steal any.
But Alex, have you tried the new Wi-Fi? Because the Wi-Fi is new.
Oh, maybe I didn't pick it up.
Yeah, you might not have had the new.
I'll go back outside later. Because Peace Park would be great. And it would be great if we would be able to just use our own Wi-Fi. But what would happen in terms of public comment? Like, would we still do that virtually?
Sorry, I've been talking away and on mute for a while now.
Oh no.
I'm like, what? So I was thinking, so if we were either in a straight line 6 feet apart in front of Village Hall or some kind of staggered thingamabob, that people could actually, so I mean, one of the things I like, there's pros and cons of doing these meetings. There's things I like about them better, but obviously things I don't like the whole like have to do your public comment on YouTube thing. Like, people could come to our meetings and they could either, just say it to us and we could repeat it, or they could stand there with their phones and I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but it would provide an opportunity for people that could come to our meetings. Obviously, we couldn't have too many people come, but I don't think that's a problem we're gonna have.
They could drive by comment. They don't even have to get out of the car.
Yes, do your public comment from your car. No,
And then we could implement the people's microphone to make sure, we're just repeating back what they say.
or if there's some way that we let them into the Zoom. If you come to Village Hall, we give them the Zoom, they zoom in on their phone and they do their public comment, which creates a better record anyway, I think, than us repeating it.
Yeah.
Or it replicates,
The issue with having multiple Zooms in one place is that you will pick up each other's voices. And so it'll come in a very layered way, and you'll end up having this like crazy reverb echo situation.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point. I didn't think about that. You think 6 feet is close enough for that effect?
Definitely. Maybe less so outside than in an enclosed space for sure. But I mean, it'll depend on how good your microphone is.
Well, maybe if we all just implemented earbuds.
Yeah, I wear headsets a lot, and we could do earbuds too.
We could totally trial run these kinds of things before it's actually happening, just to see, you know, we don't all have to be there. But just to see what that's like.
Yeah, I mean, there may be other ways. That's just what came to my mind. There may be other ideas. I have no idea. I'm on team post-COVID. We need to do more things outside. So why not do this outside before we have to go back inside?
I'm about it.
And then if there's members that are like can't make it or don't want to do it, they can just do it this way too. So it can accommodate whatever.
So Ariana, how would we try? Would you like go outside and test the Wi-Fi?
Well, yeah, that would definitely be one part of it. I might try to like do it with Alana so that, you know, since she's been very helpful and also would be potentially managing these things. We've been working together on a lot of it. But I would probably just go outside with her and have us both on like computers or phones and just kind of test run with earbuds, test run with computers, and just see if we're both talking, how it comes out, and do like test videos. Maybe we'd have to have a third person who's not next to us listening just to see. But yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so let us know if you think it's a good idea after you and Alana test it.
All right, sounds good.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I don't think there's anything else this evening, so I motion that we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Bye.
Bye. Buenos noches.
Good night, everybody.
Hi, everyone.